with everything given a nice deep cleaning. Heavy rust has been knocked off of the outer parts. All the other parts have been inspected again. We are in a good heavy coat of paint put on it. We are ready to start working on the seals. I have the seal kit laid out over here, the pinion seals and everything, the rack seals. Make sure everything was there before we started tearing everything apart. And we are at the point now we can start putting this all back together. We're going to start with the rack itself. We're going to go ahead and this rack bearing has a seal on the back side here and an O-ring that we'll have to remove, and also this hard O-ring right there to remove. Let me get the other stuff out of the way and we'll get putting this back together. We're going to start with removing this. There's a seal on the inside here that needs to be removed, and the O-ring on the outside. That's these two right here. And then this seal will go on right there. I'm going to start with removing this one here. Try and remove this one here. To slip the other one on. You have to be careful, but we don't want to mar up or scar any of the metal. So, there's a couple different assortment of picks, and you can just work your way around that one. That one broken off. Garbage off to the side. This one here, I do have to get the other O-ring that goes underneath that. I have off to the side here. So there's your O-ring and your seal for here. Put these out of the way. Again, just using a pick. Get down in there and pull it off. There we go. Nope. Remove that O-ring. New O-ring that goes underneath. And then just work this around back onto its position. Let's take a good look. Bring this over, again, O-ring and a seal. Pick this O-ring off. Before we put the O-ring on, all of the seals in this, even the ones that were in the tube here, were in there pretty hard and stuck in there pretty good. So it might take a minute, but we'll work on getting this one out without damaging or marring up any of the metal inside on the outside. All right, that seal's out. Just wipe it down. That's why I didn't want to put the O-ring on just yet, because it took a little bit longer. And I didn't want to scar or damage the outer edge of the O-ring. And now we can put the seal back in, the new seal back in. You're gonna lay it flat. You don't want to really push with screwdrivers or picks or anything on the seal itself, because you don't want to damage that, obviously, because that's what seals the fluid from one end to the other end. I can get a socket to fit around this to tap it in, which if it doesn't go in fairly easy and flat, we'll do that. There's a spring in here that helps retain this part of the seal, its position and shape when it slides around on the shaft there. So we don't want to damage that spring either. Let me get a socket, and we're just going to go ahead and get a socket to fit this and try and tap it in lightly. All right, just got a simple socket. We use this to try and press it in evenly. Hammer, tap it in. And get it on a hard surface. I had to do that on a harder surface. The table moves too much. So we'll socket on. The seal as level as possible on there, and then it was a couple taps. Didn't damage. You look, just double check. Didn't damage anything of the seal around the outside. It is now set down inside there, and this one is good to go. You can also look down inside the center. You look down the inside to see if it's seated all the way around properly. This one is. Take our O-ring, put our O-ring back on, the new one. O-ring's back on. That seal's complete. This O-ring and seal is complete. Slide this back on to the rack. You can see how much harder it is to get on there now with the new seal. Now they're sealing a lot better. The old ones were slipping and sliding pretty quick, or easily on and off. The rack is done. We're going to move over to doing the pinion first, get the pinion done. Then we'll move to the pinion and rack housing. There's 2 seals to go in there, and then we can reassemble. So let me get this out of the way. Bring our pinion in. Our pinion, so our pinion parts going to be the dust cover, which is last to go on. We can put that off to the side. Your C-clip or retaining clip, people call them different things. That can go to the side. We don't need that yet. This is your seal for the top, right below your dust cover. Again, that one's last to go on. That seal goes in. That seal actually goes right here on the top, inside the pinion housing. We do have a seal that we have to stick down inside there. We'll cover that in a minute. Now we're just working on the pinion. So now to the pinion part, we have our bearing, which will replace this bearing right here. There's no need to grease this bearing. The seal is up here, and the other seal is down below here. Those 2 seals allow the power steering fluid in between here. From this point down, there's no fluid. this will be greased along with the rack, on the teeth on the rack. So yeah, again, this bearing here is lubricated by the power steering fluid. There's no need to grease that. And then the seal here just keeps everything from falling out. So there's a bearing. Our 4 matching these orange ones. These are just green, same thing, just different color manufacturer. Our seal for the bottom. This is the seal that goes into the housing. We're not going to install it on this, on the pinion. We're going to install it on the housing and then slip the pinion down through it. So that one will sit to the side. This goes underneath of the seal I just showed you. Our bearing for the lower end, where the bolt goes on, right here. This bearing sits on here, holding the bottom side of the pinion to the rack. That has to be greased. Again, off to the side. And then just the other parts to seal it up. Bearing is pretty simple. There's no direction or anything. Either way you put it on there, it'll work. Pull the old bearing off. Garbage. Before we put the bearing on though, we're going to go ahead and work on removing these, just like the seal here on the rack, the white one. We got to remove these 4, and then we'll slip all 4 of the new ones on. Again, just be careful not to mar up the metal too much. Trying to not gouge it up at all. That one. Just easier to break and snap them off than to try and slide them up and down. All right, just going to inspect it again. Just wipe down any crud that might be in there. This one's fairly clean. We sent this through the cleaner. No. I like to just wipe it down one more time. So, like on the rack underneath of these seals, there was an O-ring underneath of this one. There is not O-rings underneath of these. They just sit directly in the channel. Again, making sure when you put it on there, it sits flat and doesn't get twisted. If it gets twisted and you have to take it off, more than likely you're going to damage it and you're going to have to get a new seal kit for it. They're not easy to get on and off. Well, they're easy to get off, but they're not easy to get back on. So take your time. We have those 4 on. I'm going to let them relax a little bit. I did have to stretch them to get around. It did stretch them out a little bit. They'll relax and go back into the correct position. While we're waiting, easy enough. Slip your bearing on. With that, we're going to go ahead and put that to the side again. Like I said, we'll let that rest. We're going to work on the rack housing now. We have 2 seals to put on, and then we can start assembling it. This seal right here is the one I told you I can't show you, but it goes inside when I was removing it. Your fluid in and out for left and right. The seal is roughly about here. We'll stick that inside the tube with a socket pushed on here that matches the size. Slide that down and seat that to its position here. And then when I showed you a minute ago here with the rack pinion, stick that in there. Same thing, a socket to fit this one. Stick that one down in there. As you can see, got the seal in there. Now we'll just push it down with the socket. And if we need to, tap it. Insert your socket. Push it down, keeping it level. There. It's in its seated position. Oh. Right there. Oh, there you go. Right here. Roughly right behind that opening. With that, we'll work on the pinion housing seal. See, that has a little bit of a cut in it, slit in it. Once you get down in there, it's a little slight squeeze and it slips down into the position just below where the seal sits inside here. Stick a long pair of needle nose pliers, grab the hold of the one side of that white piece, slight twist, and push it down into its seated position down in there. Kind of see it. There you go. And now the seal sits on top of that. Again, another socket that fits around the seal. If we can't get it all the way down in there with our fingers. Just to be sure it slipped in there, just to be sure it's seated. So you can just push it with my fingers. It's easier to do it with the fingers than it was the socket. The seal's sitting in there on top of your white ring in there. Okay, now that we have our seals in place in the housing, we're ready to reassemble. We've got all of our seals on the pinion and the actual rack. We're ready to reassemble this now. I want to show you something before we get into the assembly. This is an important step here that's going to take some learning, and or it's just going to take some time. Have some patience with this. As you can see on the pinion, I got these zip ties on it. Same thing on the rack, zip ties on it. That's where that white seal on top of the O-ring was. And right where these are at is where the green seals are. Those O-rings on both of them are made out of Teflon. When you put, there's a tool that they make that you can use to stretch the Teflon seal out. Here, let me get rid of the old one. It'll stretch the old Teflon seal out, and you can slide it on to what part you need it. After that, you have to resize it and make it smaller. And to do that, they do have a tool that you slip over it and it squeezes it back down, resizes it. I don't have that tool. There's another way you can do it. I don't rebuild rack and pinions for a living, so I don't need that tool. Take a soda bottle, plastic. That's what this is right here. Take it all, cut it apart. I'm sure you can see in the video, but I cut the plastic to wrap completely around the pinion, and a piece, you can actually see better here on the rack. You can see the plastic on the rack. Cut one out for that, one out for the pinion. I wrapped the plastic around, protecting the Teflon seals, and then take zip ties and tie the zip ties down on top of the seals. They do the same thing. They will squeeze and resize them back to a smaller size, allowing you to be able to slip them back through and inside the housing. To do that, like I said, take the plastic, put it over top of your seals. Start with just one zip tie at a time, going hand tight, as tight as you can get them hand tight. Take a pair of pliers, because you do have to put some pressure on it. Take a pair of pliers. Once you get it as tight as you can with your hands, grab a hold of that, stick your thumb down there where it comes together. Take a pair of pliers and give it a good twist. And well, that one came off, so we can show you what I was talking about. Give it a good twist, tightening it up on the Teflon seal. So as you can see, the Teflon seal is right there. Take your zip tie, run it over that Teflon seal and that plastic protecting the seal. Tighten it down best you can with your hands, keeping it over top of the seal as best you can too. Once you have that as tight as you can get it with your hand, take your pliers and give it a twist, holding the side down, stretching it even tighter. Get it to be center over the seal, so it's putting even pressure all the way around on that seal. Just give it about 5 or 10 minutes with them sitting on it. And when you're, after that 5-10 minutes is over, as you're getting ready to reinsert them into the housing, cut the zip tie off, remove the plastic, and you should be able to slide it back in. Before we get to the pinion, we've got to get the rack back in. So again, we'll leave that zip tie on there. I'm going to put a little bit of grease here on just the slight edge of the teeth to assist it in sliding over the seal inside here. Not a ton, just a little bit to slip over without damaging it. This will be the grease we're using once we have it reassembled. This will be the grease we're putting in to the pinion and the rack anyway. That'll just help it slip through the seal a little bit better. the rack bearing on the end. We're just going to put to the side. We don't need that on there right now. And now we will stick this in the housing to slide it through the seal up here. Doesn't matter which way the teeth are going yet. We just got to get the rack inside there without damaging the seal in here, while also making sure this seal slips in. Which, take a look at this off to the side here. Now remember, those seals are new, so they're going to be a lot tighter. And also there was that spring I showed you. I'll kind of show you in this one. There's a spring right there, and there's one on this side, or on this seal as well. You don't want to damage that spring, or you'll be putting a new seal inside there. So we've made it past. We're inside through the seal. We're going to go ahead and cut the zip tie off, and fingers crossed, this slips into the housing. Okay, with that back reinserted back into the housing, go ahead and put this piece back on. Slip that on there and push that into its seat. And just get something to, as you can see here, it's on the edge. I have to push it down into there so that way we can get that metal ring back on to hold that in place. So let me get something to push that in with. Now with that piece inserted to where we can put that metal ring back on, we'll go ahead and get that metal ring, put this back on. That metal ring in place will now keep it from this piece from popping back out. Gonna come over here. We have to line up the teeth now. We have to line the teeth up here. So when we put the pinion in, the pinion will line up with the teeth. To do that, gotta get some grease on it. Get some grease on the pinion gears, and then we'll get that inserted back inside there. All right, so we'll check the teeth, get them lined up best we can inside there to run the pinion in. Go ahead and grease up the pinion gear. Those teeth are greased well enough. We'll just wipe the rest of it down on here. And then when we're done getting the pinion in, we'll shift over the rack and put the rest on there. So with that, teeth are lined up. We're going to go ahead and get rid of the zip ties and the plastic around here and slip the pinion in. seal through there. We'll work and spin the rack as we get the pinion back in there. So I took the pinion, as I pushed it in, I didn't have to move the rack, took the pinion and spun the pinion, turning the gears back onto those teeth. As you can see, seated on the bottom, seated down on the top. We'll go ahead and start putting the bearing on, seals on, and the bearing on the bottom. So we got the top bearing, the C-clip, the top seal, the other C-clip for this, the nut for the bottom, and the cap for the bottom. Dust cover will do last. So before I do the top bearing and the top seal and everything, I'm going to go ahead and work on the bearing on the bottom. But I'm going to go ahead and pack that with grease first. Clean this mess up and we'll stick that in there. Stick that down on the bolt. All right, had to go over on the table that's not so soft, the harder table. Again, another socket, lightly tapped, seating the bearing back down inside. Now we can go ahead and put the nut back on. And tighten down the nut. All right, so with the bearing seated, we're going to go ahead and tighten down the nut. We'll probably spin the rack as far as it will go that way first. Okay, the rack is as far as it'll go. Tighten the nut down. Don't over tighten it. I didn't torque it. There's a torque spec for it. I didn't torque it, but don't over tighten it because it'll bind up that bearing and that bearing will go bad early. All right, so with the nut seated down, we're going to reinsert the C-clip into there. Double check to make sure it's all the way down in there, which it is. Take our dust cover cap, put that on there, and we'll tap that on. Snapped into place. Again, double check and make sure it's seated all the way on there. Now we can go ahead and work on the top. So for the top, our bearing, get our seal, slip the seal over the pinion shaft, just like the other seals, make sure it goes in flat and level. the bearing and the seal put on there. The next C-clip on top. All right, now that C-clip is in place. The only thing left on this to do will be the dust cover. Dust cover is in place. Now to the rack guide on the back side here, which will be your spring, the lock nut, the rack guide itself, and the cap. I'm going to get some grease on the back of this. Stick the rack guide back down in there. Take your spring, the little indentation in the rack guide, the spring just sits in that. Take your cap back over it, just a little pressure down. Get that to catch the threads, and then we'll tighten it up. That down, we can now put the lock nut back on. Take spin the lock nut back down. Just going to give that a few taps. Make sure it's tight. It's on tight. So we have our 2 power steering lines that have to be reinstalled. The third line is that breather line, the breather tube between the 2 boots. That I'm not going to put back on until we reinstall this back on the truck. With the 2 transfer tube lines back on, we're going to go ahead and stick the rest of the grease on there. Just going to run this in and out for a minute here. Get the grease spread out. That's good. Just put that in the middle, close to the middle. Reinstall our caps. Just slip them on there for now. Both sides. Get our new bushings out. All right, so everything installed, put back together. We're going to go ahead and put the bushings back in. Now it sits in the truck this way, so I'm going to take the seated base, and that's going to come, this side will be against the cross member of the frame rail, and then these washers and backing plate will sit on the other side once we bolt it back into the truck. And now the two new bushings are installed, and this is ready to go back on the truck. All right, everybody. So that completes rebuilding your rack and pinion. The next step for this in another video will be getting reinstalled on the truck. We still have other suspension parts to take care of on that. The only thing we did not put back on here, like I said, was we have the outer boots, or the inner tie rod, but outer boots, the crossover tube that will have to go on there, and then your clamps. I appreciate you guys watching. If you like this stuff, consider subscribing and hit that thumbs up.